Hello and welcome to another programme in our Destination History series. And today we have a very special guest, a man synonymous with the music industry and a man known to very, very many people in Uri and indeed a lot further afield. I am speaking, of course, about our guest, Michael Carlin. And Michael, you're very, very welcome today.
Thanks very much, James. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Lovely. Well, Michael, as I said there in the introduction, you're a man that is synonymous with music. And could you tell us how you got into the business with Carlin Records? As I remember, it was 1A Hill Street.
That's it, 1A Hill Street. And if you remember also, below that in all the adverts we had, it said 1A Hill Street, opposite the market. So people, matter where I go and meet people, that say Carlin Records opposite the market. And now, the strange thing about it, I saw an advert there last year for a new business that was opening down our end of the town, and it said opposite Carlin Records. So the things turned full circle.
So you really made your mark, Michael.
But it all started, James, right back in 1961, and I was still at the Abbey Grammar School, and about to go in to do what in those days was the senior, and then became the O-levels and now the GCSE. So sort of going into sixth year in school. And my father had been in business in North Street, Baker and Carlin. It was an electrical shop, you know, all electrical items. And then they were doing TV as well, and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and all like that. But they also were electrical contractors. You know, they did electrical work, say, for Disraeli Hospital and Armagh Down Creamery, which was further down this street. They were the electrical contractors for that. So there are all these big contracts. But my father, who was very sort of far-sighted, when TV, he was the first man to bring TV to Uri in 1953.
Queen's coronation.
Exactly. And he put an aerial on the top of the town hall, and he brought in the TV signal from a transmitter called Kirkus Shots in Scotland, and that was the start of that. And he saw then that the future was in home entertainment, TV and radio and hi-fi and all of that. So in April 1961 he left Baker and Carlin and started up on his own in Hill Street, at 1A Hill Street. And the reason why it was 1A was that number one was the Connolly family residence, which was above the shop, and they actually owned the premises. So their address was 1 and the address of the shop was 1A. So my father started in April.
Not to stop you, Michael, but who were the Connolly family?
Well, it was Mrs. Connolly, and she ran a little sort of a confectionery shop, and Jack Connolly, her son, famous Irish dancer, Lord of Mercy, and Jack is dead and gone now, but they were wonderful people. And Mrs. Connolly was a lovely, lovely lady. And I'll tell you a story. When my father went down there first, it had been the shop had been rented to a gentleman, not mention his name, and he ran a record shop and it called The Disc. Now, when my father went down there, he had no intention of the record business. He opened up with all his electrical things as usual, and people were coming in and looking around the shop and saying, "Have you not got the records now?" And so after a few weeks, my father said, "There must be something in these records. We'll have to get into it." But just go back to the Connollys for a moment to give you an idea of who these people were and how decent they were. When my father went down first, the rent was £5 a week. And previous to that, the previous occupant of it left town very quickly, owing a lot of suppliers and owing Mrs. Connolly, God be good to her, a lot of rent. So my father started to pay the £5. And then after a few months, Mrs. Connolly said to my father one day, "Mr. Carlin, when you close up tonight, would you call up and see me?" So my father said he would, but he was very nervous because he thought Mrs. Connolly's going to put up the rent. So when he went up and they sat down and exchanged a few pleasantries, and she said to him, "Now, Mr. Carlin, you've been paying me rent of £5 a week from next Saturday," and he paid her religiously every Saturday, put it in an envelope and handed it to her. And she said, "From next week, the rent will be £3.10." She reduced the rent. And that was the start and establishment of the relationship that we had with Mrs. Connolly, and after she died, with Jack. And they were very, very decent people and very decent landlords, and we got on extremely well with them. And I'll always remember them for that. You know, that in the early days when things were very, very quiet and it was very difficult to get a business established, that she, in these days now, and you read businesses being in trouble with what's known as upward only rents, Mrs. Connolly brought the rent down.
That's a unique story.
And I'll never forget that. So after then, a while, my father decided he would bring the records in. And in those days, James, and even though it was 1961, which seems very modern times, there were still 78s. You know, the old shellac
plate size.
Exactly.
Records.
And just like a plate, if you dropped it, it smashed. And the sound quality was absolutely terrible. And it was only then, the first big revolution really in it was the 45 singles. And then the 12-inch LPs came. In between that, there was, I don't know whether you remember this, a 10-inch LP, slightly smaller than the 12-inch. And there were maybe say 8 or 10 songs on that. And then when the 12-inch came, you had 12 or 14 tracks. And that really was the start of a revolution, because also around about that time, the first of the pirate radio stations came, Radio Carlin.
Fitted out in Greenoa Port.
Exactly, and sitting out in the Irish Sea. And in those days, you see, the radio didn't really cater for young people. You had the light program, as they called it, and the nearest thing that you would get to any sort of popular music would have been Workers' Playtime or one of those. And then there was the home service, and it's mainly classical music that was played on that. So young people really couldn't hear the music that they wanted to hear on the radio. But then when Radio Carlin came along, then within a short time the BBC realised we're losing a lot of listeners, and then Radio 1, 2, 3 and 4 then came on. But
I think Radio 1 was 67, wasn't it?
Yes, and Radio 1 never would have happened only for Radio Carlin. All of a sudden people could hear the music that they wanted to hear, and that was the start of the whole the pop revolution. So your father Joe, he got into the records, and when did you come into the shop? Well,
Michael?
He opened in April, and I started to go into the shop on a Saturday, and then going on a Saturday, and any day we're off school, and then I went in then for the full summer holidays. Went in July, and when it came toward the end of August and we're due to start back to school, as I said, to do the senior in September, I said, I'm not going back anymore. I'm going to go stay in the shop. Now, there was a brother Newell, God be good to him, was the headmaster in the Abbey Grammar School at the time. Wee Harry, affectionately known as Wee Harry. And Wee Harry nearly lost his mind and sent for my father and me. The two of us had to go up. And I have a younger brother, Paul, 14 months younger than I am. And when we went up to the school, Wee Harry said, and he'd have it of doing that and pointing, take the other chap, meaning Paul. He wanted my father to take Paul into the shop and leave me at school. But I didn't do that, and stayed on in school. I went into the shop and left school. And there were times like when business was tough and things weren't going so well, and I would have seen fellas that I was at school with, and fellas that I knew that I was further up the class than they were, no disrespect to any of them, but they were coming out and going to university, and then a few years later coming out of university and becoming teachers and doctors and solicitors and accountants. and I was in the shop, and the shop wasn't going great, you know. And I thought to myself, you know, did I make the right decision? But looking back on it, and hindsight's a great thing, it was the right decision, because my life would have been completely different if I hadn't done that. And recently somebody said to me, is there any one thing that you couldn't do without in your life? And my answer to that is music. I couldn't do without music in my life. And if I hadn't gone into the shop, music wouldn't have played the important part that it has done in my life. Yeah,
it did.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, when you were growing up, and we'll talk about the music again in a moment, but just give us a flavour of what life was like growing up in Hill Street at that time. Like the neighbours, the shopkeepers like Brenton Gallagher, people like that, Boyd's next door to you.
Well, you see, I always think that end, like we ourselves were reared in Water Street, you know, lived in Water Street. But when we moved down there to Hill Street in 1961 to the shop, we still lived in Water Street. But there was a great camaraderie between all the traders at that end of the town. And we always said that from what is now Dunn Stores, was Quinn's the milestone. From Quinn's the milestone to Connor's, as it was then, chemist.
Yeah.
You could have got anything you wanted in that sort of small space. And I still think that that end of the town, again from Dunn's now down to Boots, or actually on down to, say, Jackie Rocks and Bennett's, that part of the town has still retained its character in the sense that, and I'm just thinking, it is, I think, all owner occupiers. It's all local traders. And I think that's one thing that we've lost a lot, that so many of the established businesses then passed on to one generation, maybe the next, but then the next generation didn't keep it on, and then something else has moved in, and the character of the street has changed. But that end of the town, I think, has retained that. So we had, you say, Russell Boyd and Brendan Gallagher and McCurry's newspapers.
The Miss McCurry's.
McCurry's. Like, that was a fantastic place.
That's right.
It's
the Catholic, what was the
Catholic Repository.
The Catholic Repository.
And I remember when I went down there, maybe even when I was younger, and look up at the sign and see Catholic Repository and say, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, but
you probably wouldn't be allowed to put up a sign back today.
Well, but it's interesting, you see, now that when McCurry's closed, Bennett's took on a lot of that business.
Yeah.
And Patsy, and I'm sorry I can't remember her second name, lady's dead now, but she ran the sort of Catholic Repository end of Bennett's. And now, you see, that really has become a big business, because you have another one up where the post office used to be, and now you have Veritas right on the Mall. So there's a lot of business in Catholic repositories now.
Oh, no doubt.
But you had all of those, and moving all up, you had Oliver Gibbons, and then on the far side, actually down the far side, like from J.V. Kelly's down, hasn't changed very much. Grant's, of course, is gone now.
Louis Jellett.
Louis Jellett.
I remember it was a tobacconist shop.
A real tobacconist. And also the other thing that Louis sold that you couldn't really have got anywhere else in the town was snuff. Snuff.
I knew you were going to say that. the little tins.
The ladies went in there for the snuff, you see. And then, of course, you had Frank Sweeney, the chemist. And Frank's wife sadly died there just a few weeks ago.
Rosina Sweeney, I saw that.
Yes.
The lady, she lived in the Glen.
Yes, she lived in the Glen.
Yeah.
And I used to meet her when I would go down to the Mercy Home, and my mother was there, and Rosina was there, and we'd been able to talk to her there. But when people would have gone in to Frank, and Frank, you see, of course, was the pharmacist, and if somebody needed a prescription dispensed, they would have to run down the yard, down to White's yard, because Frank would be down at the back playing the fiddle, the running of the business and the dispensing of the prescriptions was only secondary importance to the fiddle playing. He was a great man for the traditional music.
Now you mentioned White's Yard.
Yes.
And there was a particular trade went on there too, wasn't there?
There was coffin making.
Coffin making
down there.
Yes.
And there were a lot of businesses down there, but you had seen the coffins coming out of there.
That's right.
You knew there was a funeral coming off, and then beside that, there was long before Specsavers, Horace Rundle's. They were spectacles, and they only came maybe 2 or 3 days in the week, and on the other days the shop would be closed. And then beside that, you had McManus's,
the pawn,
and great business
I
altogether.
know one local family, and a lady told me that her job on a Monday morning as a child was to go to John the Pawn, as John McAlevey was known.
Yes.
And bring the family Bible, and that was to be pawned on a Monday morning.
The Bible was to be pawned. What sort of value would the Bible raise?
I didn't go into that.
I wouldn't think you would get very much for it.
But whatever it was much needed.
Yeah. Oh, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, you see, the one thing about the pawn, and like one of the big problems, and we hear a lot about that now, and is not only illegal money lenders, but a lot of these cash to payday cases, and exorbitant rents. The pawn really was the only way prior to the credit union, which is the best thing ever happened to the town. Prior to the credit union coming, the only way that you could raise cash instantly was to go in. Now, on a Saturday night, we stayed open to 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. Most of the shops down that end of the town would be open to 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, and be great atmosphere, buzz in the town, because at that stage there was two-way traffic, parking on both sides of the street, so there was an atmosphere on the street.
We forgot about Filoni's, Michael.
Filoni's. There's a book published a few weeks ago by the Newry Writers Group called A Rake of Yarns.
Yes.
And I went.
Joseph Alphonse
is very featured in it, but one of the stories in it is by a chap called Tony Carroll. And Tony has great stories to tell, and be a great man to be interviewed here, because he was away with the Irish Army.
That's right.
In the Congo, but he has a great story in it, and it starts off. I met her in Dix, which was the name, like, for Filoni's.
That's right.
It's a brilliant story. So if you ever get a chance to read that story, and maybe get Tony in, to read it there. But this particular Saturday night, McManus's had just closed up. They had a sort of a half gate. The door was locked and a half gate in front of it.
Yeah.
And then there was a hall doorway. And these two boys came down the street dressed in these immaculate sort of Crombie coats, and arrived down to McManus's to discover it was closed. Panic stations. They were looking up and down the street, and then they decided to ring the bell on the hall door. And they rang the bell on the hall door, and a man, Marky, his first name will come to me in a second, he opened the door, and there was a discussion at the hall door, and the hall door closed, and a few moments later the shop door opened. The two boys looked up the street, took off the two Crombie coats, handed them over the gate, and the money was handed over, and that was us drinking money for the night, and off they went. So they'd have been in maybe on Monday morning to collect the coats again. So again, that back to the story, instant cash.
Oh yeah.
It was a great place.
The forerunner to the credit union,
exactly,
as you say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you were saying there, like John McAlevey, but the man who actually owned the business was also a man called John Shannon.
Yes.
And he was the owner of the business. And when he died then, a man who also worked there called Joe McConville. Joe then bought the business.
Joe had a brother called Jimmy.
That's right.
That dealt in cattle, and
exactly.
With Tommy Fitzpatrick, who would have been a one-time neighbour of yourselves in North Street, Water Street.
Well, one of the saddest days down at that end of the town was when there was a car bomb just outside McManus's, and McManus was completely demolished. And while Joe rebuilt the shop, he never opened it again. And that's when Tavies moved in then.
Yeah.
Tavies came in at that stage. But Joe really hadn't the heart, you know, to reopen it. You know, it was very, very sad. But he was a great man too, Joe McConville.
And then of course, Michael, as well as that, most importantly, and you mentioned it, that you even used it in the address, the vibrant market and Hector.
Exactly.
I'll never forget Hector down at the Mary Street end, and we used to go in to watch him.
So it was an entertainment, you know, to stand there watching him. And you know, when we were young, like, we wouldn't have realised that, you know, you would have people planted, you know, in the audience to bid on the things. We were too innocent in those days to understand that. But you could have stood there, and it was a morning's entertainment.
And every article, there was only a few left.
The last.
Joe, give me out. There's only 6 left.
Exactly.
But Joe kept handing them out.
And he would say, you know, start off and say, if you were to buy this in the shop, it would cost you £5. But I wouldn't charge you £5. I'd not even charge you £4, and then he would knock it on down.
Right
and
down.
Who's going to give me £1, 10 shillings? And then all the hands would go up. And the first hands to go up were his own employees who were planted in the audience.
But he was a true artist, a super salesman.
He was brilliant at it.
Definitely.
You say then, and just recently there, I was looking at a website and trying to book flights, and went on to the date, and when I clicked on it, it said only 2 left at this price, and that was a real Hector technique, because that's only a stunt to try and panic you into buying it.
That's right.
And that's how he operated. Well, better get it now before they're all sold out.
And then we used to have the arrival of the fun fair in the hay and straw market.
Well, you see, an indication of how sort of precarious business was at that stage, and how little disposable income people had. The week that, say, the hobby horses, as we call them, the week that the hobby horses would be in town, our business would be down, because the few shillings people had to buy a record, say, I'll not buy a record this week, we'll go to the hobby horses.
Yeah.
You know, so there was very, very little disposable income. And it really was only then, sort of the middle and the end of the 1960s, that people had any disposable income. Every penny that they had was accounted for before they got it.
Now, Michael, Carlin Records evolved into a very successful business. What was the catalyst for that development?
Well, when my father opened first, and I was saying to you there was no sign of the records, the name above the door was Joe Carlin and Sons. Now, Sons plural. Now, my brother Paul never stood behind the counter for an hour in his life. You know, that wasn't his sort of forte. But then, as the records began to grow, and my father thought back, well, the shop was called The Disc, but then we wanted to retain the name Carlin, but we had to have the record somewhere in that, so it then became Carlin Records. But one of the first master strokes, really, that he pulled off was, and this gave us a sort of a national profile. At that time, there was no record pressing plant in the south of Ireland. The records had to be imported from England. And so a record, say, was released, the records used to be released on a Friday. So all the new releases come out on a Friday to hit the weekend market. So that would have come out on Friday, but then the master copy of that had to be pressed, and all these other copies of it pressed to send over to Dublin. And then the EEC didn't exist at that stage. There was customs and all sorts of problems. So by the time that the records were pressed, all the customs documentation done, it could have been about a month before you could have bought that record in Dublin. Now, one of the people who needed the new releases as quickly as possible were the show bands. Like, they couldn't be learning a song a month after the record came out. So my father put an advert in the Irish Independent, and every day the Irish Independent had a show band column in the paper, and it was, say, show bands looking for engagements, halls looking for bands. So my father's advert read, show bands heading north, stop off for 5 minutes at Carlin Records and get a month ahead. So the next thing then, on a Friday evening and on a Saturday, outside Carlin Records, you had the Royal Show Band, the Miami, the Cadets, the Capital Show Band, all these bands. Their wagons were parked outside our door.
And all the big ones.
All the big ones. And then, you see, the word got around among all, particularly the young teenage girls. Oh, Brenton Boyer's down in Carlin Records.
Yeah.
And Dickie Rock's down in Carlin Records. So that drew a crowd in on a Friday and on a Saturday. And not only that then, but it raised the profile, and one band told another, and then the bands used to ring us up and say, could you post that down to me? So we got the name of being associated with all these bands. And the interesting thing about it was, there's a big music publishing company called Carlin Music, and on the sort of the rim of a 7-inch single, all the details, all rights reserved, copyright, all of that, and then it would say Carlin Music. So the people thought that we owned the thing.
And you did,
you know,
you certainly
didn't put them past their notion. So, but that sort of raised our whole profile, and we got associated with all these bands then, and that meant that it drew the crowds in then.
Now, tell us about the famous oval-shaped counter in the shop.
Well, in Belfast, Robinson and Cleaver's department store, they had a record department, and when the record shops then started developing in Belfast, like say the Gramophone shop and the Premier record shop in Smithfield and all those big shops, when they all opened, like Robinson and Cleaver's, it was all right when they were selling, say, Victor Sylvester and all these, but they knew nothing about the pub business. So they quickly realised, like, we have to get out of the record business because we don't really know it. So my father heard about this, that they were closing down, and he went down to see whether any sort of fittings that he could buy from them to sort of bring back and use in our own shop. And there was this, as you say, oval shaped counter, and there were 3 record decks built into it, and then there were holes at the top of it and these stereo headphones.
That's right. Yeah.
So you could put on the record, and then the customer could put the headphone up to their ear and listen to it. So you could actually serve 3 customers at the time. The 3 records would be going independently, and they would all listen to it.
That was cutting edge technology at that
was.
time.
Nobody else had it. But the problem then was, when my father had bought it, and I honestly don't know how much he paid for it, how was he going to get it from Belfast to Newry? Because we had no transport. Yeah. And my father never ever drove a car. He had no driving license.
I didn't know that.
He had no car.
Right.
But Billy McCann, God be good to him, dead and gone too, was the projectionist in the Frontier Cinema.
Yes.
And that was another thing, that one of the things that my father did was that he would give the Frontier Cinema 3 records every week, and they would play them before the programme and in between the 2 films, and then an advert would go up on the screen. All records played in this cinema are now available at Carlin Records, and they swapped them over every week, 3 different ones every week. But Billy undertook to go to we had to go to Belfast anyway, because we went to Belfast to get the films.
Yes.
And drove up to Belfast to get the films, and this thing arrived then in the shop. And sure, it nearly caused a riot when people saw it, because this was the first time that people were actually able to listen privately to the records. But the other great thing about it was there was massive storage underneath it. You could store all the LPs all underneath it, because we only put out the sleeves, but the records had to be stored underneath.
Yeah.
And I remember one day this top executive from EMI Records in Belfast arrived in the shop. Sorry, from London. He arrived in the shop, and we had just got all new browsers in. Everything was all out on display. And he looked through all the LPs on display, and he said, "I like your display, but," he says, "you're making a big mistake." And my father says, "And what mistake would that be?" He says, "Well," he says, "you only have the sleeves on display."
Joe told him we live in Uri.
And he said, "You should have the records inside that, because if I lift that up and it's only a sleeve, well, but if I lifted it up and there was a record inside it, I would have that sense of ownership. I would want to own that." And my father says, "That's exactly why we haven't got it there," because the more we'd walk out the door, then would be sold.
Yeah.
And the number of shops who did try to introduce that by putting the records inside very quickly reverted back to just having the sleeves out.
I would think so. Well, talking about the show band scene, and that revolutionised music across Ireland, and of course we in Uri were major contributors, Michael, with some of the singers, the calibre of Peadar Cowan, Eleanor Toner,
Exactly.
Tish Grattan.
Well, you see,
to name but a few.
Is right. You often wonder, like, in such a small area, how there was so much talent. And of course, the big band that was known all over the country was the Hilton Show Band.
Yeah.
And when they started first, and they were not the first, but one of the first bands, to have a girl singer. Like Eileen Reid probably was the first.
With the Cadets.
And possibly Muriel Day with Dave Glover before that. But the two front singers, like Ricky McVeigh and Eleanor Toner, I think the combination of those two together were very, very hard to beat. And then the other big thing that the Hilton had was this magnificent brass section led by Luke Burke. And Luke, you see, had been in the Irish Army Band and a really top-class musician. And whereas a lot of show band musicians couldn't actually read music, not only could Luke read the music, but he could arrange it. And that was one of the great things that the Hilton had, that they weren't merely sort of a carbon copy of the record, but Luke could arrange the stuff. And he also would have done vocal arrangements, for harmony, for the backing singers. Like when the boys would be backing the lead vocalist, he would have parts all written, for the harmony of that. So that was a big advantage. And you'd look on the trumpet, and Dee Dee Donnelly on the saxophone, and then a great addition to them then from the Grafton Show Band, who were a great, very, very popular band. John Hughes then came in on trombone, and John was also a great singer. So while all those people were very, very talented, the man who made the biggest impression of all was Mickey Dorn, because Mickey was a showman on the guitar.
Oh yeah.
And famous guitar player in the Miami show band called Clem Quinn and Mickey Dorn, I think, were the two big show band guitarists at that time. And Mickey just didn't stand there and play it. He sold the thing.
Yeah.
And he also had every night he would have a couple of songs he would sing for a long time. He would have sung a lot of Chuck Berry stuff and My Ding-a-Ling and all those, and he made that his own. He's a really great musician. And then with the Ebert Clark arrived then with the Epic Show Band.
Yeah.
And again, a great big band sound. The two Poocher brothers from Dominic Street, Gene and Jerry on trumpet and trombone as well. And they had a very powerful sound, but the one thing that they also had was this magic man, Peadar Cowan. And when Eleanor Toner went on the London Palladium and sang and got engaged to Pat Jennings, and then decided to move to England, Malachy O'Neill, who was a very astute show band manager, as soon as that happened, he moved for Peadar. And got Peadar into the Hilton. And you see, that coincided with Tom Jones being huge. And there's nobody could sing Tom Jones like Peadar Cowan. And a great showman.
Well, Cowan, I always thought that with Peadar Cowan, he had a tremendous stage presence. And you know, it was effortless to him, as you say, like of the big numbers.
Yes. When he would have done, say, What's New Pussycat or Delilah, the crowd stopped.
Yeah.
You see, there were very few singers who could stop the crowd. When you would have gone to see, say, the Royal Show Band in the Town Hall, the majority of the people there weren't dancing. They were standing, maybe say, anything up to 20 deep in front of the stage, watching the band and watching Brendan Boyer.
Yeah.
Dickie Rock to a lesser extent, but Peadar Cowan could have stopped the show.
Yeah.
Because when he would have done any of those big numbers, people just stopped. And as you say, it was the stage presence and his movement, and you know, the sound, Peadar Cowan's sound.
He still has a finesse.
Oh, he has. But you see,
you know,
the music or the song wasn't coming from here or from here. It was coming down from inside him.
Yeah.
I think the music was in his soul and was coming out. You know, so he stopped the show when he would sing.
In later years, when he took on the big Elvis numbers, like American Trilogy, as you say, it does two things. It stops the crowd completely, and then it brings the house down.
Exactly, yeah. But you see, it's a very special talent, and to know, you know, how to hold a crowd and then just deliver the killer punch at the end, and he had that.
And of course, Michael, we couldn't have this conversation without mentioning Patricia Grattan.
You see, Patricia to me was the greatest natural talent of them all. When I think of Patricia, I think back, and this is to me as if it was last night, in a top talent show in the Parochial Hall, and she was representing that end of the town, Canal Streets, the barracks, all of that. Now, each area had its own name, and I can't think of what that name was. And a famous lady produced that show. Lottie McKeown was the producer of that show. And
sadly, no longer with us.
No longer with her, and I can tell you a wee story about Lottie in a minute. But Patricia, one of the big songs of that time was Tommy Steele, Little White Bull. And it was the very, very early days of a microphone like this. And Patricia had this pinned onto her dress, and she came out to sing a Little White Bull, and the microphone went off. It made no difference whatsoever. Patricia could still be heard at the back of the hall. Perfect.
Fantastic voice.
Just this great, again, a great presence, and she filled the hall. She knew how to project her voice.
For me, one of the best local performances that I've ever seen was herself and Peadar Cowan singing River Deep Mountain High.
River Deep Mountain High, and the other great one that they did, and first time I heard them doing it was on a sponsored program in RTE, and they did Johnny Cash and June Carter, It Ain't Me Babe, and that was absolutely brilliant. The two of them together were magic. Sadly, she never fulfilled her true potential, and that's very sad, because she was the greatest natural talent of them all.
Yeah, a raw talent.
Raw talent, yeah.
No doubt,
yeah.
No doubt. But Peter, even today, I mean, he's phenomenal. The way that he can still give the big performances.
You see, he never ever lost it, you know. And you sometimes say to yourself, when you see artists who were big, say in the 60s and 70s, and recently I saw Val Doonigan on the Late Late Show, and it was an embarrassment. And you say, why don't you just stop? Let us remember how good you were.
Yeah.
But the reason why so many people do it and keep on doing it is that it's the buzz that they themselves get from doing it. But the likes of Peter Cowan never ever lost it.
No.
And you would like to think that when he does lose it, he'll realise that himself and stop doing it. But
no, I'd say when that day comes, Pat will be in the box. he'll always be a true performer.
Yeah, well,
you know.
Yeah.
But Michael, how do we the big changes then that after getting to the zenith of the music, how did it sort of go into decline, the retail end of things? And
well, the strange thing about it was that I would say, let me think now, around about the early 1990s, when for the first time we heard this word digital, when that started to emerge. In actual fact, the birth of the compact disc heralded the death of the record business, in the sense that they were able to, that was the first time that they were able to take, say, a 12-inch LP and compress the files on that down to this little tiny disc, which could hold so much more than the LP did. And then by doing that, they were able to transmit it in a different form. People haven't stopped buying music, even though there is a certain amount, a lot of illegal downloads. But people are just buying their music, and their music is being delivered to them in a different way. So that instead of going into a shop and actually buying the music hand across the counter, they're now buying it in a different way. They're going onto their computer and they're going onto iTunes or whatever and downloading that and putting it onto their iPod. And you know, when I go out now and out for a walk with my iPod, or go on my holidays and take my iPod with me and think back to the days when I would have had the old cassette player, and I would have taken, say, a cassette for every day, you know, of my holidays, maybe away for 14 days, and I'd have 14 different cassettes with me, and that all in a case. And now
maybe a ghetto blaster.
yeah, exactly. And also then everything is just in this, maybe say I would have maybe say 7 or 8 hours or maybe 10 hours of music all in that little thing, in the same way as having to bring maybe say a half a dozen books. I have it all on the Kindle now. So the digital revolution then happened.
Well, Michael, as well as that, a very important aspect of your business, which has been revolutionised totally, was ticket sales, concert ticket sales.
I remember in 1968 going up to a concert in the Ulster Hall, and it was run by, well, Capitol Records were promoting it, but Jim Aiken was the man who was looking after it. And I would have known Jim through the show bands. He would have run I think the most famous dance in Northern Ireland was the big band date on a Tuesday night in the Orpheus in Belfast, which was above the Co-op. And Jim ran the big band date there every Tuesday night, and we would have gone up there regularly, and then been in and out of the Parochial Hall, and Jim would have brought a lot of bands there. But so I saw this concert advertised, but I was thinking, how am I going to get the tickets for this concert? So I rang up Jim. I says, Jim, I need a couple of tickets for Bogowans. No problem. They'll be at the door for you. So I went along to the Ulster Hall, picked up my 2 tickets, went to the concert, and there's Buck Owens there, and Gene Shepherd, and all these famous American country singers. And also on that show was Brian Call, who nearly stole the show. So afterwards then, we were talking then, and then a couple of days later, I rang him up. I said, you know, we could sell those tickets for you. So that's how the whole thing began. And we were the first record shop outside of Belfast. Harrison's in Belfast became the big ticket outlet in Belfast, and we were the first ones outside of Belfast to have the tickets. And Jim was bringing in all these top international acts, and we had all the tickets for these. And from a very, very early days of that first concert to the pinnacle of that, which was when Gareth Brooks came. And I remember Jim arriving in the shop with all these tickets in a kind of a sort of a sports bag, and we went up to the top of the house where we had our wee office, and the tickets were all spread out on the floor. And he says, "Do you know how much those tickets are worth?" I says, "No." He says, £91,000. And in those days, like, that was huge money. But on the morning of the concert, the tickets were to go on sale at 8 o'clock. And so we said, we'll go down early and get organised and get ready. And chap that used to work for us on a Saturday, Jerry McManus, Jerry would have come down early, and he would do the door and only let so many in at a time, so there wouldn't be a crush. But I arrived down, the queue was at the Frontier Cinema. And I looked at the queue and I thought, we might have £91,000 worth of tickets, but there's no way that we have enough tickets. It would have needed the miracle of the loaves and the fishes for us to supply all these people. So the decision was, in order to be fair to everybody and serve as many people as possible, we would only give each person 2 tickets. Now, there was going to be war. But just as we were about to run out of tickets, the phone rang. Jim Aiken on the phone. "How's it going?" I says, "Jim, you know, we're nearly sold out. The queue was at the Frontier Cinema when we arrived. It's back to the Frontier Cinema again." He said, "Do you have invoice books there?" I says, "We do." And he said, "Everybody who comes to the counter, give them a receipt for 2 tickets, and I'll not let you down." So I knew that I could take Jim Aiken at his word.
Yeah.
Because Jim Aiken did business on a handshake. And he brought Gareth Brooks, who was the biggest artist in the world at that time, to Ireland. And there was nothing written on paper.
Handshake.
On a handshake. So the people were coming in, and I'm saying, like, whatever the night was, the Saturday night, that's completely sold out. There are going to be extra shows. I have an assurance from Jim Aiken that you will get 2 tickets. So writing out all these dockets, Joe Blogs, blah, blah, blah. And all we took was their name and their phone number. And I said, you won't have a choice of which night you will get your tickets for, but you'll be guaranteed 2 tickets. Yeah. So that went on, and there were 10 shows in the RDS in Dublin. And we had tickets for every single person. And not one person was let down. But to give you an indication of the high regard that that man was held in, and also the sort of a person that Gareth Brooks is, that when Jim sadly died, and at the wake and at the funeral, all the big names were all turning up. But on the day of the funeral, when Father Brian Darcy said the funeral mass, and he read out messages from Bruce Springsteen, Elton John, Billy Joel, Dolly Parton, all these people. He didn't read out a message from Gareth Brooks. Gareth Brooks and Tricia Yearwood, his wife, got on a plane and flew the Atlantic to be at Jim Aiken's funeral. And when he was asked why he came, Gareth Brooks says, that man was awesome. And he flew the Atlantic to be at his funeral.
That's a marvellous story, and a marvellous tribute to Jim Aiken, the late Jim Aiken.
Well, you see, he did business with Gareth Brooks on a handshake, he did business with me on a handshake. And anything that he ever said he would do, he honoured it.
That's a truly marvellous tribute.
And I'm glad to get the opportunity today, James, to say that, you know, so that people can hear that and see it. Because to me, in terms of the entertainment business in Ireland from the 1960s up to, say, 2000, he was the biggest figure, I think, in the entertainment business in Ireland.
And revolutionised it.
Revolutionised completely, and brought big name artists, particularly to Belfast, at a time when you and I wouldn't have gone to Belfast.
That's right, when no one would come.
He brought people like Charlie Pride and all these people, and they came on the assurance from Jim Aiken, don't you worry, everything will be all right. And they came and he looked after them and made sure they were safe. So that's a great tribute to him.
Well, once they had his say so, they felt safe, they felt confident.
That was a reassurance.
Oh, truly marvellous man.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, personally, your best concert that you've attended, who would you say over the years?
There are so many memorable ones. We saw Boney M and ABBA within 2 or 3 days of each other. John Denver was absolutely brilliant. Dr. Hook, Kenny Rogers along with Crystal Gale on the same bill. Charlie Pride several times. But the one that sticks out in my mind, and my wife Joan, who came to all these concerts, and Jerry McManus and Scylla, we travelled together to all these concerts, and I think they would say the same. The first time that Johnny Cash came to the Adelphi Cinema. The Adelphi Cinema was one of the big concert venues in Dublin. And when we went in, we always like to be in early, and we were there maybe say half an hour, 45 minutes before the concert started. And about a half an hour before the concert started, announcements started to be made. 30 minutes to showtime. Mr. Johnny Cash will be on the stage in 30 minutes. And for the first time ever, there is no smoking in this theatre tonight. So that was repeated about every 5 minutes. Mr. Johnny Cash would be on stage in 10 minutes. So the excitement was all being built up.
A hype.
So you had then the first act on the stage was a group called the Gatlin Brothers, Larry Gatlin and the Gatlin Brothers. And then June Carter and her sister Carter family, they came on. And then there was the interval, and then Johnny Cash came on the stage, and all those artists then came on the stage. And I was sitting there watching the show, and I was saying to myself, in terms of the presentation, we talked earlier there about stage presence. This man had a stage presence. But he never moved. He didn't have to move. Like, he sat on a stool or stood. But you were looking at this and saying, that's Johnny Cash. Am I really here? Am I in this audience watching Johnny Cash live? And the one thought that came through my mind was, I would love that there was another show tomorrow night exclusively for all these, what I would have called pseudo country and Irish artists, and bring them in and say, that's country music. That's the way,
and that's how you do it.
That's how it should be done.
Yeah.
And the man was just magnificent. And the only other one, and as I just started to tell that story, the one that came into my mind was, again in the Adelphi Cinema, was Tommy Wynette. When Tommy Wynette was #1 with Stand By Your Man, Jimmy Aiken got the opportunity, just a last minute thing, of a date that was free. But at that time, you had to give the Adelphi Cinema 3 weeks notice for them to cancel the film on that night. So what happened was the film went on, and when the film was over, say at 10:30 or 20 to 11, the people came out and we all went to the concert, and the concert started about 11 o'clock. And I had some business to do with Jim after the concert was over, and a sister of mine was living in Dublin at the time. So we went up to her flat, she was nursing there, and got the tea and went back down. Now at 3 o'clock in the morning, just before we left, there was a crowd was rushing the stage looking for autographs. And Tommy Wynette said, if you rush the stage, I'll not sign any autographs, but if you form a queue, I will sign every one. And when we came back down, Tommy Wynette was sitting on the end of the stage, and there's a queue nearly the length of the hall, and 3 o'clock in the morning she was still getting autographs signed and getting photographs taken. And I thought to myself, you're a real star, because you realise these people are your customers.
Well, Michael, I had the same conversation with Cathal McCoy here, the boss of Destination Uri. And as you know, Destination Uri promoted the Furies and Davy Arthur last week in Bellini's. And we commented on how they interacted and mingled with the audience afterwards. And I said to Cathal, you know, you could see there was that bond with those people who were paying their money to go and see them. They didn't brush them aside. They stayed, they signed, everybody got their picture, their autograph, whatever they wanted. But as you say, there is a tendency nowadays to brush people aside, and the Furies now were a classic example of doing it right.
Well, I mentioned a name to you earlier there, the first concert that I ever went to in Belfast, Buck Owens. And Buck Owens wrote a song called It Takes People Like You to Make People Like Me. Without the audience, the artist is wasting their time.
True enough.
And if you want that audience to come back, you look after them the same way as somebody in a shop. If you look after your customers and treat them right, they'll come back again. But if you just take their money and dismiss them, who's next? They'll not come back. You have to make the customer and the audience coming to the show, you have to make them feel valued. That's the most important thing.
Well, Michael, do you miss the business?
I would say for the first 10 years, I missed it every single day. And it took me a full year to make the decision that I did make, you know, to sell the business. Because I was in a situation where all my girls were sort of finished school. They weren't coming into the business, even though they had been there from, they were knee high, serving in the shop every Saturday, school holidays, Christmas, all of that, and they absolutely loved it. But I knew they weren't going to come into the business, and I didn't put pressure on any of them to do that, and I'm glad I didn't, because they all had their own careers. And I thought to myself, well, if they're not coming in here, why am I still here? And talked to a lot of people and consulted a lot of people and made the decision, right, I'm going to sell this business now. And I made the decision then to move the business online, you know, and I set up this business called Irish Music International, which we did all Irish DVDs and CDs and all of that. But all my customers were all over the world. But the one thing that I hadn't taken into account, that instead of meeting my customers across the counter and engaging with them, all my customers were now on a screen. So I had no contact with them. And that nearly drove me crackers. I had to get out twice a day and go down the town and walk Hill Street. And in the same way as I still do. You know, when I go down the town and I come back up again, and my little granddaughter, who's 5, says to me, "Granda, did you forget to come home?" Because I have to get talking to the people. So when I was stuck in this office that I converted one of the bedrooms into an office, and all these orders were coming into on the screen and going to Australia and Canada and America and all of that. But I couldn't see those people, and they couldn't see me, and I couldn't talk to them. And that had an awful effect on me. So when my daughter and her husband bought the Spar business in Bestbrook, and now they also have one up at Clog, and they invited me to come out and help them, that changed my life completely again. Because
you have contact.
As soon as we've talked a lot about artists and going on the stage. When I get in behind that counter, that's like being on the stage.
That's your stage.
That's my stage. That's my sort of, and so the customers are my audience, and the engagement with that, and that gives me energy, and it's oxygen for the brain, and that's what keeps me alive. My father, God be good to him, said one time, Monk's Hill Cemetery had just opened up. And people were saying, "Oh, wouldn't like to be buried away up there, and it's awful cold up there," and all this sort of nonsense. And my sister-in-law said to him, my father, it was on a Sunday afternoon, my father had his head buried in the Sunday Times, and she says, "Well, Granda, what do you think?" And he says, "I don't give a damn," he says, "where I'm buried, as long as I die in the shop." So I'll probably die behind the counter.
Well, Michael, certainly our audience today have enjoyed listening.
I hope so.
It's been absolutely brilliant, as I knew it would. And thank you very much, James, for coming in.
Thanks for inviting me, James.
And sharing your memories with us.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Thank you, Michael.